I got it. Oh, Benfica.
Parabéns, Hotel.
Yes, that's right. Parabéns. Parabéns to all the portistas.
Okay.
How many of us are there? Just Telmo and I are portistas, I believe.
There's like the saying says, meia dúzia de gatos pingados.
That's right. Yes, in California for sure. We lost Mary. Hopefully, we'll get her back. Well, anyway, thank you all for participating. We will start right now. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Our topic is racism and discrimination, a California Portuguese-American perspective. We are partnered up the California Portuguese-American Coalition, which is an organization that began now it's in its fourth year. And it's the purpose of the California Portuguese-American Coalition is one only, which is to have debates and forums in the Portuguese-American community and to elect Portuguese-Americans to the State House, to local offices, to Congress if we can. And we are obviously nonpartisan. We're the California Portuguese-American Coalition just wants to elect Portuguese-Americans. We partner up with the Portuguese Beyond Borges Institute at Fresno State. This forum will be archived at Fresno State, part of our Portuguese Oral History Project. So we're grateful to all of you for joining us. We're going to take just a couple of minutes from each and every one of you. If you could just give us a little bit of a brief bio about yourself, who you are, and introduce yourself to the different participants. We are on Facebook Live. We're being recorded for our YouTube channel, and we have right now about, I think, 29 participants so far. And so if you'll take just a couple of minutes, give you a brief bio about yourself, tell us who you are. I know all of you quite well, and I'm thankful that you're here. I know Anthony a little bit less, but I know the others quite well. And I'm sure that people throughout different parts of the world don't know who all of you are as well as I do. They don't have the pleasure of knowing you as well as I do. So we'll start on top there with Rosemary, if you don't mind, and just take a couple of minutes, please. Your Portuguese connection.
Sure. Rosemary Serpicasso. So I'm not married to a Portuguese. So that brings in a lot of conversation, right? But born and raised here in Tulare. I moved to the Bay Area to go to school. And that's where I met my husband. My parents are from Peak. So I'm first generation. They're from Madalena, Viva Madalena. And they immigrated here in 1968. But like I said, my family has been involved in a lot of the Portuguese celebrations with Festa do Espírito Santo and Festa Fátima. So ever since I was a little girl, we've been part of the Festa, and I started to get involved as an adult once I had children of my own. And so since 2012, I've been part of the Festa committee here, also part of LUSO, and remember all the insurance other than LUSO, the SBRSI and UPPEC and all of that? Yeah, that was me too. Being a part of that. So it's a pleasure to be here and share our experience of, especially my experience of marrying out of our culture. And then also even, I know, and actually raising children with two different cultures. So thank you.
Thank you. And Anthony, you want to take it next?
Yes, my name is Anthony Esteves, or those on Portuguese, Esteves. It's fun being confused with Emilio when you're going to school. So Spanish, Portuguese. I am a writer and podcaster. I currently am a contributor for the entertainment website Latino Review Media, covering all movie and television news, mainly the stuff that's around Star Wars, superheroes, all that stuff. And I am the creator of the podcast Based on a True Journey, which you may have heard last week on the Portuguese-American Radio Hour, and co-creator of a comic book podcast called The Capos Crusaders. We talk about all comic book stuff. My Portuguese connection, my parents originate from Terceira in the Açores. My father's family originates from Altades, and my mother from São Bartolomeu. My grandfather, José Esteves, was one of the people that started the Our Lady of Fatima Festa in Thornton, over here in Northern California. Thornton, again, has a population of 500 people, but in that weekend in October could get 20 to 30,000 people just to visit the Early Fatima Festa. And my grandfather on my mother's side, José Martins, he was a contria singer at the numerous festas that would go on both here in the States and over in Portugal and the Azores, as well as my grandfather's cousin, Joaquim Esteves, was a radio and television broadcaster out of San Jose. So that
Very
is
famous. Yeah.
yeah.
An icon.
Yeah,
So
right.
You're from the Esteves icon family. Yeah.
Right. So I'm as much as Emilio Estevez and Charlie Sheen and Martin Sheen. But that is my that's my Portuguese connection.
Thank you, Anthony. And Telmo?
How's everybody doing?
Very good.
My name is Telmo or Telmo Faria, as most people call me. I'm a executive chef and owner of Uma Casa Restaurant in San Francisco, California. I've had the restaurant for about 3.5 years now. It's San Francisco's only full-service Portuguese restaurant and one of too few in Northern California. And fun fact, I'd like to think a good student of Professor José Luis da Silva at San Jose High Academy.
Great student.
Yeah, I'm sure he was. He's great. So he speaks Portuguese perfect, so I'm sure he was a great student. And Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary Xavier, and I grew up in Tulare, very involved in the Portuguese community growing up. Then I left to college in the Bay Area and came back and haven't been as involved the last like 10, 15 years until I had children, and then decided I wanted my kids to be involved and to learn the richness of our culture, just like as I grew up in it. My parents were immigrants from Amin, State Açores, in 1966, as came most of my mom's family. My dad's family is still there, and so we have the pleasure of visiting Amin State about every 3 to 4 years, and my kids love it. My husband loves it. And so it's always a nice summer vacation to go visit our family there. Professionally, I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker for 21 years. I worked for Child Welfare Services here in Tulare County for 13 years, and I've been with the Tulare County Office of Education now for 8 years as a licensed clinical social worker with the Mental Wellness Services Program. And my husband is Black Jamaican, and my children obviously are biracial, and they love both of their cultures, and I'm very happy that we're able to expose them to both. And so, kind of like Rosemary, I'm married outside of my race as well, and so that's something I can share as well as we have our panel. Yeah, I think that's about it. My kids attend the Portuguese school at St. Aloysius, and they love being involved in all of those activities, especially the plays and singing and all of that. So I have 2 little hams that love to entertain. Not like their mom's way shyer than they are.
And José Luis will have my generation, our generation go last, okay?
There we go. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I was born and raised in Ponta Delgada in San Miguel, and I came to California with my parents and sister in 1969. And my uncle lived in Oakland, so we went to live in Oakland. He lived in the hills. We couldn't afford it. We lived in East Oakland. And so I went with 16 years old. I went to Laney College, a community college in Oakland that is mostly African American. It was a fantastic experience for me. It really opened up my eyes to a whole perspective in the world that I had never encountered, because in San Miguel, we might have had a couple of people of African descent, even though a lot of us Azorians have African blood in us because of our history. Let's not forget that for over 500 years, the Moors controlled what is now Portugal, and therefore we have this mixing of races and blood in us, which I think is enriching. So I went into this experience in Laney, and it was really a mind-opening experience, because I was able to see completely different people, the African American community, and get to know people. Not just generalities, because I think we're talking about racism. Sometimes racism comes because of generalities. When you get to know the people, what's important to them, their feelings, their humor, a lot of barriers break down. So a wonderful experience there. Then I went to Cal State Hayward with that had a Portuguese program. And I studied several languages, including Portuguese. And there I was very active in Portuguese things in the Portuguese community in Hayward, started teaching there at adult school, etc. When I got my credential, I went to live in Tualabi County. I had to teach there. That was right after Proposition 13. And you know, that was the toughest time ever to get a teaching job. So I went to teach Spanish and French and English in the high school in Tualabi County. In there, there was an American Indian population, an Indian rancheria right outside the campus. By the way, now they own that famous casino that a lot of Portuguese go for gambling. Those were those kids, those people, that community. And so I got to experience another community, ethnic community in California. Then in 1982, I came back to San Jose to teach Portuguese, mostly at the middle school first, and then to San Jose High, where I finished my career, teaching mostly Portuguese, but not all, including in a Portuguese International Baccalaureate program. I retired in 2010. I'm married to an Anglo-American. You know, it's not a different race, but it's a different ethnicity. So, after I retired, I continued to be involved in the Portuguese community by being in many organizations, such as Liz American Education Foundation, where, you know, Liz is very familiar with that. And I was chairman of the board and president a couple of times. In Poço, in San Jose, Portuguese Heritage Publications, and other organizations like the Portuguese Athletic Club. So my perspective is that sometimes I was really into the Portuguese community, as you could see in Oakland or in Tualabi County. But in San Jose, I was very much into what was going on in the community, even though I was living out in a city very, very close to San Jose.
Thank you, Luis. And so I'm gonna kick out a question. Actually, there's three of them together, and we're gonna follow a kind of whoever feels to answer first. You know, don't feel intimidated if you don't want to answer first. So I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular, but I will use the theme that I've used, like Luis. First of all, I should say who I am. I think everybody knows I'm Diniz Borges, and I am the founding director of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at Fresno State. I'm the president of the California Portuguese-American Coalition, and I'm involved, as my wife tells me every day, in too many darn things. So, when I taught high school, I always used to have the two V's, those V's, which you're either a volunteer or you're a vítima. So it was one way to get students to participate, and volunteers also always got more points than vítimas, so I always had a lot of volunteers. José Luis knows about that, and I think we have, as one of our participants, Bruna, who was José Luis's student, Bruna Faria, who is now a teacher at Tulare Western High School here in the Valley, and knows about that as well, very involved in the community. So my question is this, based on our theme. So do you see racism in our community? And if so, how do you see it being manifested? And you yourself, have you ever felt any racism or discrimination, or seen it firsthand on someone else from a personal or an organizational aspect within? This is in the context of the Portuguese-American community that we're all involved in one way or another, or have been. So that's kind of a threefold question. You can take any or all of it if you'd like to. Do you think there's racism in the Portuguese-American community in California? We're referring this to California, obviously. We have people from different areas. So we have all the way from the South Valley all the way up to San Francisco. And, you know, how do you see the racism in our community being manifested? And if you yourself have seen it firsthand, either being a recipient of it or just seen it around community organizations or things that you've been involved with in the Portuguese-American community. So it's kind of a threefold question. You can take any or all three of them. Is there any voluntario, or shall I do the vítima bit? Oh, Telmo, you're the best. That's why you got all A's.
He gets all the points now.
I think Portuguese might have been the only class I had an A in. Mr. De Silva was my Edward James Olmos.
And in deliver, nice.
But Sadly, yes. There's racism. I wouldn't say it runs rampant or that it's blatant, but as far as I can remember, there's always been racist undertones in conversations, and the way I've heard it from people closer to me, people that were friends or people that were acquaintances, or just in gatherings at social clubs and different organizations. And it's not to say that in the way that it was expressed that it always had inherent ill will, but it was there and it was prevalent. I think that, in my opinion, and it's an extension of the racism that exists in Portugal, racism that hasn't been addressed on a large scale by Portugal as a country. To Portugal, we all know one thing we have to do is step back and take accountability, and not to say that any of us personally or anybody watching this or that will watch this committed that perpetuated those or committed those wrongs or those kind of things but the Portuguese were some of the earliest and the kind of the biggest transatlantic slave traders, that from shipping slaves from Africa to South America, but then North America, and just to Brazil alone, it was 5 million slaves taken by the Portuguese to Brazil. Eventually, the Portuguese outlawed the slave trade in Portugal, and Portuguese slave merchants then were continued on to taking slaves and selling slaves in North America, in America. So I think that's one kind of major cloud that hangs over the Portuguese community, is that there's never been an earnest at-large attempt to address this as a culture, as a people. We always like to look on our history proudly, and of all the contributions we've made and the wonderful things that we've been able to contribute to the world and had the world contribute to us. And I'm very, very proud of that. Let me start this conversation off by saying there's no part of me that's not proud to be Portuguese. But I think part of being proud of who you are and your culture and your heritage is accepting some of the transgressions that occurred, and not just cherry picking the good parts, the parts that are convenient for you and your life and your narrative, and then almost just dismiss the rest of it as if it didn't happen. So I think might be long-winded here, but I don't. But I think the situation is that I think it stems largely from Portugal as a country never addressing this. So I think going back to, I know that some of our grandparents or great grandparents didn't get the opportunity to go to school, but I think just in studying, because I've actually had the opportunity to study in Portugal. I lived there for a little bit in Faial, in the Açores, and actually got a chance. So I did study history there along, with the rest of the school curriculum. And it just was never, it was glanced over. It was briefly mentioned, but never addressed in a way that there was any real accountability for it. So I think when you do that, it really just kind of plays into this privilege of of these conquistadors that went out and found all these beautiful lands, but we never address what happened to the people that were there, how they were treated, what we did with the resources, and being major players, huge in the transatlantic slave trade. I think that's never been addressed as a country. Secondly, I would then fast forward to ultramar, and you have a whole generation who basically black people, African people were the enemy, and they were forced to fight. And the same way some of the same attitudes that you see here in the United States from people that fought in Vietnam, perpetuated towards Vietnamese people or Asian people, because they were forced to see these people as the enemy for so long, that now you have a generation that grew up disliking, despising, having a certain amount of racism towards Black people. And I'm speaking specifically right now about Black people. There's some, the Portuguese, to be fair, they had slaves from Japan, they had slaves from Korea, they had slaves from China. But here's more the inherent racism, is that at one point, Portugal, the king, banned slavery from those countries, but still allowed Black slaves to be brought to Portugal and traded. So even in slavery, there was inherent racism in the process. So we go through that, which never been addressed. We go through a generation that fought in ultramar and the colonies and what took place in Africa. And then I think the third fact that I would attribute to the racism that I've seen in the Portuguese community would be that Portuguese were immigrants. But I don't think, not to say there weren't hardships and trials and tribulations. I know what my grandparents went through, and I know what many people went through, and good, honest, hardworking folk, and God bless them for that. But for all intents and purposes, they didn't immigrate to this country as people of color, as people from Latin America did, as people from Asia did, as people from Africa or the Middle East coming into this country. You were seen as an outsider. The Portuguese had the ability to assimilate into popular American culture and pass, so that's why José became Joe's,
right?
And Antonius became Tony's, because it was important at that time to not be seen as an outsider. So if you're assimilating into popular American culture, and popular American culture, white culture, is saying, hey, these people are bad, or these people don't belong with us, you start to buy into that. Well, I think you take all those, we're talking about centuries going back, 400 or 500 years, even longer, of this building up and never addressing it as a community or as a country, first and foremost, then as a community. And you couple that with today's social political climate, where you see people from the community siding with different political parties or different opinions on that, and you start seeing the racism come to a fever pitch and bubble up and get to the point where we are witnessing it today, where they bought into the institutionalized racism that takes place in this country.
Well said, very well. Yeah, indeed, and thanks indeed for the historical aspect of it, because I think that those are things that do mark us as a community. It's part of our idiosyncrasy that sometimes we aren't even aware of it. But I'd like to hear from all of you. So who would like to go next after Telmo?
I notice it. I used to notice it more at the festas in the 90s. I was born in 82, but like the 90s was when, high school age and all that. And I was noticing racism at that time from friends of mine at the festa who would just resort to certain slur words like it was nothing, like it was just another word you say. They would, and when I'm talking about the really bad slurs that they would mention. And it was a word that I never would imagine using in my household. My father and mother would never stand for any sort of racist slurs at home. But I go to the festas, and the majority of the time would be a lot of the kids who are of blue collar families, who are farmers, and they resorted to those slurs. And I didn't like it, but didn't make a big stink about it either. I stayed quiet in my head. I'm like, why are you resorting to that? Why are you saying that? I don't understand why you got to go that route. I will say lately in festas, I haven't heard it as much or seen it as much as I used to. Doesn't mean it's not still there, but I want to say during that time, the 90s, is when I really noticed it throughout all the festas we go to. And it wasn't like all blue collar people were like that of the community, but it tended to be of that. And of that of that class, of that culture. And it was also, I believe, has to do with the generations, because their parents or grandparents came from the time when Stad Nov was still government, and they lived through the change. And Salazar, he banned people from getting into the country because he was afraid that liberals and communists would come into the country, and those tended to be Jews that would come into the country. So there was this closed off feeling that the older generation would have. And I'd kind of get a glimpse of that from my grandma sometimes, so just this closed off feeling you'd have about certain things. And so I think you see that in the generations after that are raised by that. And I would witness them at the festas, and to them, saying certain terms was no big deal. It was just, that was just normal to them. And I'm over here like, mm-mm, mm-mm.
Rosemary?
Yeah, I think for me, one of my daughter's best friends is an African American boy, and my dad, I love him, but it's based off of El thing, and I'm like, no, Dad, it's not the thing. His name is Darius, and so it's really, for me, I've noticed it, I've seen it. It's just like how we call Emishkenj. Well, no. That's a human being just like you.
With that tone
yeah.
too, isn't it? In the face.
And it's like that, like that's a bad thing. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, why do we automatically go to that, to that area? Why do you need it? They're a human being. That's so and so. They're not defined by their solely by their culture or their ethnicity. So that's been an interesting part, and especially living in the Central Valley, that's very, very conservative. I am more on the liberal side, and so sometimes I bite my tongue, and more so, it's definitely trying to change the culture, and with the protests, having those kinds of conversations with my mom, who is 77 years old, because she's like, I don't understand why they're doing that. And so having to have that frank conversation of, you've never been judged because of your color. And my husband, he's Italian. So he looks white. He is this, he's assimilated, but he looks Portuguese, right? So he was welcomed into the Portuguese culture because everyone thought he was Portuguese. He's not, and so I can't wait to hear what Mary has to say, because it's that experience where I've been there and I've seen it, where an African American is treated completely different than the same type of person being white, and so why? I've always known, like you cut someone, they bleed the same way. And so why are they treated differently?
The Mishkenj comment makes me laugh, because my closest friends in high school were Mexican, because we related on so many things, whether it be culture or religion or what have you. So I got lumped in with being Mexican in high school a lot, and I was like, sure, cool.
What was this? Steves too.
That too. That doesn't help. I know.
Mary, do you mind commenting on that and adding to? Obviously.
Yeah, I just asked my husband earlier today, as I was thinking about this forum, and I said, how do you feel like we go to Portuguese festas all the time. We go to Terceira, where he's the only Black person on the island. It just feels like a lot of times. But and I said, how do you feel like when we go to festas? Have you ever felt like that people were looking at you weird? And he feels like he was very welcomed. Of course, he's taken 1 year of Portuguese with Senor Borges, and he's hoping to take more, because he really loves our culture and wants to learn to be able to communicate with our family in Terceira. But he doesn't know Portuguese very well, and so he doesn't hear some of the things that I hear. So I do hear some comments here and there, sometimes under the breath, that's not meant for me to hear, but Portuguese are loud, so I hear it. And so I do hear it sometimes. And I don't think it's like ill intended, or like in a mean spirited way, but it's kind of like, oh, that's the Black guy that Mary married, and so it's just kind of like that. So, referring to him, that's his identity. He's the Black guy. So it's, and Fortunately, it has never been like in a way where I felt that it was being very in a mean-spirited way, because I would say something, as even though I tend to be more quiet, but I think, you know, in that case, when it comes to my family, I wouldn't be able to hold back. So thankfully, I haven't felt that it was like in a mean-spirited way, just more of like, it's just kind of like the cultural norm, you know, kind of like what Rosemary was saying. It's, you know, that's that Black guy, that's, you know, so-and-so's son-in-law. So.
One of those where it's not out of anger, it's out of they don't know the right words to use.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
You,
But
do your kids, I know they're very young still, but have you felt anything because of them being biracial? I mean, which is, you know, which is a you know, normality in lots of families throughout America, but, you know, people don't look at that. Have you felt any of that towards the kids at all, or no?
I haven't. I mean, my kids are very outgoing. They talk to
They're
everybody.
great.
They know a few, you know, they know a few words in Portuguese, and they will maximize their vocabulary with whoever they see. So everybody just thinks they're so cute. You know, so it's, I have not. I mean, I think that would even hit me harder if somebody were to make some derogatory comments towards my kids, but I haven't. I mean, they like I said, they attend a lot of the Portuguese functions. They're involved in some of the Portuguese functions, and everybody has welcomed them.
Before we turn to Luis, just a little bit, you know, we were talking, and as Telmo mentioned, you know, some of the historical data, you know, that we carry as part of who we are as a people and as a culture. And you know, and when Mary said that, you know, when her and her husband and her family go to Terceira, he's one of the few African Americans, or probably there's a couple, but not many African Americans or Africans in Terceira. You know, and José Luis and I were talking about this earlier when I was giving him some information, and we're talking about other things that were other projects. In my case, for example, I was raised with African Americans because we lived very close to the base. And so when my cousins would come from my grandmother's side, from the other side of the island, Santa Barbara and Cinco Ribeiras, they were kind of like, you know, they were just, you know, like a surprised, because, you know, the islands, as all of you know, whether it's Terceira or São Miguel, of course, much larger, or Fayal or any, it was a world from one freguesia to another. And I'm talking about the 1960s. Well, but in the 1960s, when I was being raised, and we came over here in 68 and I was 10, so we had neighbors who were African American. And so it was kind of a normal to us, you know, and I always get kind of shocked when people say that they come to the United States and they seen their first African descent person. I mean, I was raised with them when I was 2 years old, 3 years old. And so I was raised with folks who were, you know, of a different color skin than I was. And they, to us, they were just Americans. You know, we loved them all because we just looked at them as dos Americanos. They had candies for us, and then we could go trick-or-treating, you know, doing this, you know, put a mask on or paint our faces a little bit or something, you know, and we could go trick-or-treating and get, you know, candies that we couldn't see on an ongoing basis. So there's also this kind of an experience that some of us of my generation had, but it was very limited to one particular island, and even limited to a couple of freguesias around Lajes, because, you know, people didn't go far beyond that. And what Telmo mentioned also, the ultramar and the and the colonial wars. I mean, that really, excuse me, that really brought a lot of antagonism to folks that we now have in the community, because there's a lot of people of that generation. And there was a lot of brainwashing. Let's just use it as it is. There was a lot of brainwashing by Salazar. You know, that Portugal was a great empire. So Luis, and I'm sure he'll touch a little bit on this, that Portugal was a great empire. And, you know, there's a song that when I started in 1977 in Portuguese radio, I refused to play, but people here in the radio played it all the time. Guinea é nossa. You know, which means, you know, Guinea, the Portuguese Guinea in Africa is ours, you know, and so I refused to play it because I never thought Guinea was ours. And so, but a lot of it was built, you know, towards that people were basically, it was part of who we were, unfortunately, even in the Azores in the 1960s, although the Azores had and a little bit of a drop from mainland Portugal, because we too were abandoned. Obviously not, you know, we didn't have the issues that the colonies had, but we too were kind of abandoned for about 400 years. But Luis, I knew you wanted to kick in.
I'm enjoying listening to you guys. I enjoy particularly the balance of comments. And I was thinking about what Telmo mentioned about the Portuguese not addressing the slavery question. I think that's essential. And as you said very, very well, that does not, preclude us from looking at the great things that the Portuguese did during the expansion, the adventure, the discoveries, the connections, the science, creating the first global economy. That's all great, but that does not justify the slavery and the terrible things that were done to our fellow human beings from Africa. My experience, as I stated in the beginning, was mostly myself alone in Oakland with an African-American community. So I wasn't dealing with the Portuguese community and then with the American Indian community in Tuolumne. But then in San Jose, our experience was not very much with the African-American community, as Telmo would probably would tell you. San Jose High was mostly an Hispanic high school with the Portuguese program. So we had a good percentage of Portuguese. And overall, I would say the Portuguese got along well with Hispanics. That's, we're talking about racism has many faces. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I thought that the kids got along well. My classes, we ended up with a lot of Hispanic kids towards the end of the program. And they were some of the most enthusiastic students I had. So it was a very good feeling. As a matter of fact, many of my female students married Hispanic boys. However, that's referring to the students who were at San Jose High, because there were many, many Portuguese who gradually did not want to send their kids to San Jose High because we called Mexicanos. It was a Mexican school. So the racism towards Mexican Americans was very clear and prevalent in many parts of the Portuguese community, kind of looking down at what we did at our school. Often I had to come up and even on the radio to explain the great things that our kids were doing, but the Portuguese community looked down often on the poor side of the community in San Jose, the Mexicans. Having said that, I have to be just frank, honest. The Portuguese community has also worked very well with the Hispanic community in many ways. Our halls are used by Hispanics in a very friendly way. In the school, as I mentioned, I don't remember. I do not remember. Now, I'm getting old. I may have forgotten, but I don't remember an incident of conflict between Portuguese and Mexicans or Mexican Americans in San Jose High. I remember the joy of students learning each other's cultures. I do remember referring to African American students. I did have a few in San Jose. I will never forget my first day of Portuguese class, and I usually teach a Portuguese song, O Meu Chapéu de Três Bicos, and I had an African American young man in my class, and he walked out of the class, went down a hall singing O Meu Chapéu de Três Bicos. I mean, so things, and this will bring me to a point that I know we're going to address later, which is the generational change. I think there is quite a bit of difference, and some of you addressed it very well. I was very impressed by the comments of all of you, analyzing, the origins, the lack of education in Portugal, in the Azores, and then all over Portugal, the manipulation of the issue of race by Salazar and those in power. So that you guys did a fantastic job addressing that. I do believe, and I can talk about that later, that our younger people, not just the Portuguese, I think many of the young people have a much open mind in the situation. And if you want to see that, just take a look at the demonstrations on television for the Black Lives Movement, and it was in many cases very, very substantially supported by young people of all colors.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback on Mr. De Silva's kind of thoughts there. Being a student of San Jose High, I do have to say that maybe it's because San Jose High was so unique in the way that we were really the most urban school in San Jose. I mean, there's a couple other ones, but we were a small high school, old high school in the middle of the city. But we happened to have an IB program that drew people from other areas. It was very diverse, and for the most part, it was really a great experience that the Portuguese students, most of the Portuguese students, you know, we got along with the Latino students and there wasn't very many Black students, but we got along. And you know, at the time I lived on 25th Street, so I lived close to the high school, and my neighbors were from Monterrey, Mexico, and I spoke a little bit of Spanish, and I'll kind of backtrack here, but on Mr. De Silva's point, I think in the terms of like socializing at San Jose High School, it was a great experience. But also, like he said, then there got to be parents that wouldn't send their kids there because of how much interaction there was. But my personal experience, like you were saying, Diniz, about, you know, growing up near the base, I was very fortunate. I had parents who were very open-minded. I believe you might have known my father, but my dad spoke Spanish when I was a kid. I learned Spanish at a young age. He loved Mexican culture and Mexican people and spoke highly of them, and always introduced that culture. But in Fayal, his best friend was Tomaj, and Tomaj was a boat captain from Cape Verde. And Tomaj and his brother Alexandre, who was a fantastic musician, were the closest people to my dad. And so from being a young child, I always had Tomaj around. So I never thought twice about this person or persons being different. My dad spoke Creole. I very often would go, I don't know who knows Fayal, but they lived in Flamengo, and they had a big house with a yard, and I would go, my dad would hang out, Alexandre would play music, Cape-Verdean music in Creole, and they would make cachupa, which was one of my dad's favorite dishes. And so I was introduced to that from a very young age. My mom and my parents were very open-minded. There was Mormon missionaries doing genealogy on the island of Fayal, who my mom would let them host their weekly meetings at our house, because they didn't have anywhere to, you know, for the few people that they could wrangle into coming and listening to them, which is a tough sell on the islands. They were welcome at our house. From an early age, I remember my mom having gay friends. So that was never taboo in our house either. And my dad, before I was born, he worked for the Coca-Cola company and spent some time working at Coca-Cola corporate headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, where half of the employees were African American. So my early introduction into cultures was very fortunate, and I feel very blessed in that aspect. And I would say that I think a lot of people will attest to this, that I think it's more of fear or the unknown and not knowing people as to where people have these preconceived notions or judgments. And somebody mentioned that, you know, at the festas, they're welcome. And I've seen all kinds of people at the festas. But I think what racism comes down to is not just how you play nice with somebody in a social setting. It comes down to when there's an issue like immigration, what we saw, you know, with the borders and putting up walls, what we're currently seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement, when in a time of difficulties, how you start referring to people, and if it becomes a they versus us mentality. So socializing with people, playing nice. I mean, the Portuguese to me have some of the best hospitality in the world, but when something happens, or do you say that person did something bad, or does it become they're Black and they did something bad, they're Mexican and they did something bad? And that's where I say the racism lies more. And I think to Anthony's point, I think, yeah, in the 90s, I used to hear a lot more, but I think just socially acceptable vernacular has changed a lot more. So I think inherently you see it less, because I think people are also a lot more aware. And it's not, and I think to Mr. De Silva's point, generational shifts are happening, which I'm very, very excited for. But I think the racism lies in not the how the gentleman from the base would bring candies. It would be if something went missing in town and who the fingers were pointed to. if they're okay to socialize with, but don't you dare marry that person. Don't, this is where the racism lies. It's not in the out in the open social aspects of it. It's in the kind of real life situations at which point people then create a divide of it's them and then us.
Indeed. And does anyone want to add right now?
I completely agree. It's a lot of the microaggressions that that are, you know, can seem very innocent, but, you know, and it can even be quickly overlooked. But those definitely are seen a lot more than just straight out racism.
And there's a little bit of a difference in geography, because some of the things that, you know, Telmo was saying and my colleague Luis about San Jose High School doesn't apply to some schools in rural counties and cities throughout the valley, for example. Because in my tenure at the high school, I have had this class a few times and issue and because of racial slurs. Unfortunately, but I've had to do that. So, and it wasn't just once or twice, unfortunately. To where both African American students and Hispanic students as well. And so it didn't happen. I do have to say it didn't happen a lot in the last 12 years, I thought, but it happened more in the first 10 years, I thought. So there is the generational shift that we're talking about a little bit more. I wanted to, you know, now take this that we've all, and thank you all, it's been excellent. How do you see the discussion of race and racism and some of these other tough issues, you know, any other forms of discrimination that Telmo mentioned, you know, how do you see them being, you know, addressed in our community? Because one of the issues that I've heard, and of course, social media is what it is, but it is a way that people express themselves. So, and people, you know, use it, unfortunately, as the way we all know about it. We would like to have maybe a little bit different social media, but as I've mentioned before, if I was a sociologist, I think I'd be on social media 18 hours a day, because it's a tool to also read, you know, how society is behaving. And it seems like in our community, we don't want to discuss these tough issues. Okay. I've, you know, actually had a couple of people tell me that they didn't want to be part of a panel. This panel agreed right away, but I'm having 2 more panels, and it's not the easiest thing in the world. Some people don't want to be part of the panel. And I don't, you know, I'm not going to, you know, basically get a 5-page essay on them explaining to me why they don't want to be part of the panel, because they're not my students. However, they don't, and they have the right not to be part of the panel. So there are folks, including in your age groups, and I'm talking about people in their 30s and 40s, because what we're going to try to do with this, just like this panel, the other 3 panels that we want to have, or 2 for sure, is a combination with someone of my generation, like Xavier, but then bring in the younger generation, because that's the future. And so, how do we address these? How do we discuss them? Because I think that there is, and it may be geography, it may be, you know, that the Bay Area has a little bit different take on it than the entire San Joaquin Valley and even certain pockets of Southern California. But how do we talk about these issues in the Portuguese-American community? Or do we just go about doing our festas and not, you know, and not talking about these issues? Because the idea that we see from many people in many generations, and it's not just my generation, unfortunately, I wish it was mine and an older generation, is that it is not our issue. Black Lives Matter is not our issue. I'm in a couple of boards of a couple of organizations, and it was not the easiest thing in the world to bring the statements that were just statements, but they were statements. So how do you feel we can, you know, we can move forward knowing who we are? And obviously the history of who we are. We obviously cannot change the past, but we certainly can, you know, for lack of a better phrase, it's been said by a gazillion people, we can kind of mold the future. And so how do we have these discussions in the Portuguese-American community is my first question. And based on that, how do we shape these issues to where the community feels that indeed these are our issues, because we are part of the multicultural world that composes the U.S. and in our case, California.
I think it's two E's. It's empathy and education. I'm lucky enough to have connections in Northern California and Southern California because my dad's whole Steve's side is in the Artesia, Cerritos, that whole entire area down south. And I see in both Sacramento and Artesia where it's the younger generations who are the ones that are educating more, learning more about Portuguese history than we were taught growing up. Like you were told, like high school history, you're taught the bullet points and nothing in between the bullet points. And we're doing the same thing with our Portuguese heritage. I'm learning things from guys like, I'm going to plug him right now, hopefully he's watching, Brian Garcia, who tells me things about books to read like The New Jim Crow or Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And it's about not only educating about our history, but knowing that we were once the immigrants. We were once the ones that were looked down upon. We were once the ones that were lumped in with Italians and Spaniards and called Dagos. And while that wasn't very long for us, we can use that knowledge that we went through some of that and empathize with the cultures that are going through it much worse than we did, who are still going through it, like the African-American community today. It's the willingness to empathize with those instead of making judgment. We have a history of like the Italians, Cosa Nostra. This is our thing. This is our Portuguese festa. This is our sopas. This is our alcatra. You can tell some friends, but not everybody. And we need to be more like other cultures where they're having festivals for everyone to come. The Italian festival, the Greek festival, where anybody comes in and takes part of it. And we have just to have a history of being closed off. Again, it's that Salazar versus Suzamenge thing. Salazar closing everyone off. Suzamenge, save everyone, bring everyone in. I don't mean to always harp on Suzamenge. I know I do a lot. It's just I'm learning more about him as I get older, and the fact that he was so, we're all one race under God. Everyone come in. I'm here to help everyone. And why and it makes sense because a lot of Portuguese people didn't know about him until the 70s and 80s. So we have this history of being closed off. And I think education and empathy is what we need. And I'm seeing it more in those younger generations, my generation and younger, that I'm seeing in the state of California.
I think for me it's about visibility, and as I've grown older, we learn about the history of Portugal and these different countries, and even exposed somewhat to the Macanese community or Goan community. I don't see a lot of visibility for the polyp countries. I don't see when we have our Day of Portugal, a representation or an attempt at representation from Angola, from Mozambique, from people from countries that are part of the diaspora. And that just goes to speak to a little bit more of that, not obvious, but it's there. Yeah, they're Portuguese, but not really. Mm-hmm. And I think if we're going to embrace the larger Portuguese diaspora, and I think it needs to be visibility, the same way that we're seeing more visibility from the LGBTQ community in the Portuguese community now, which I think is fantastic. And I think a lot of people's attitudes are gradually changing towards that. I think an earnest attempt to have some inclusivity and some visibility for the African countries of the Portuguese diaspora would go a long ways in getting people to understand a little bit more of the history of Portugal and Portuguese culture.
You'd think with Xavier coming from Mozambique would have done that already, but
well, here's the thing. That's another thing. It's always, you hear these things. In Portugal right now, you're seeing a nationalist move, a one-person party, but the Chega party is having an effect on Portuguese, and people that I know that are close to me in Portugal are reposting things, and whether they understand it or not, that the racist I wouldn't say undertones because they're overtones of the messaging of Shiga. Whether it's xenophobic, whether it's racist, whether it's homophobic, it's starting to gain a foothold, which is scary. But I think visibility, because when Eder scored that goal against France and Portugal lifted the World Cup, he was Portuguese. He was Portuguese. But if I guarantee if he would have missed a penalty kick, it would have been the black guy. So, and that's, I'm exaggerating a little bit to make a point, but I think as a culture, we've been we've cherry picked a lot of where we like people, where we like them from at what moments. And like Mr. De Silva said, so many fantastic contributions in technology, in sailing, global economy, and trade, taking things from one continent to another, but what's the reality of all that? And I think we need to, as a community, as a culture, we need to address that head on and be like, hey, maybe some of the things we did weren't the best. So I think we need to make an extra effort now to understand where the current situation is, where people are, why people are suffering, why they're hurt, empathize with them. But from the Portuguese community perspective, I don't think we've done a very good job, including the polyp countries specifically, and giving them visibility within our celebrations.
Well, if I could follow up a little bit on what Telmo has been saying, you did mention one area that's out of this topic, but I think that the Portuguese community addresses very poorly, which is the issue of LGBTQ situation. If I can remember one or two situations as a high that where I saw parental discrimination towards their own kids was this issue of the gay issue. The Portuguese have great trouble, particularly the fathers, dealing with this issue. But that's a different topic. You did bring up the situation of the Portuguese-speaking countries. Denise knows very well that I am an interested student of Brazil. I've traveled extensively. I've read extensively about Brazil, and I think that Portuguese, Brazil is we're so proud about having one of the most spoken language in the world, but in Portugal, we're only 11 million. If we don't have the 200 some million Brazilians added to that, Portuguese language is a minuscule language, and not at any level. But we still, as a community, look down at with Brasileiros too. And Brazilian Portuguese, which is the same language, just like Spanish from all different places and French from all different places, the same language, we tend to put it aside like it's something else. And I think it's because in many ways the race issue comes in, that it's a different culture. People are afraid. And if you allow me for just one quick reference in here, one of my favorite Brazilian books is called Auto da Compadecida by Rian Suassuna. It's about religion and culture and race in Brazil. In that book, Jesus Christ comes back as a black man, and everybody looks startled. How could it be? And Jesus says, why can't I reveal myself as a black man? Mm-hmm. So even in Brazil, Brazil also has a lot of issues with race. But one of the things that it says in that book, Mary comes on and says, most of the great sins that we have is because of fear. And I think that racism, the sin of racism, is really based on fear on the other. It's not so much stupidity as it is ignorance. You mentioned empathy, not having empathy for the other, but it's because you don't know. How can you like someone you don't know? And we tend to often close ourselves in very much. Just as a closing point on this section, you mentioned visibility. This is so important. How do we see people? Now, when Portuguese think about os americanos, picture Americano. What does it look like? I think we have os americanos that are white, and then we have os pretos, mexicanos, os chineses. That's how Portuguese community sees this world. And so to Portuguese and Azorean mostly, because we're mostly Azorean, when we come over here, we come here with this such great need to integrate. We want to be like os americanos.
Yeah.
So we take the good and the bad that comes with that. And we don't often analyze why we feel and think that way. And if there's a dislike for certain things, if there's a prejudice towards a certain people, we tend to take it. Now I'm talking about the immigrant community. I belong to that. I immigrated. The generations, as we all stated, have changed, but we have this very narrow definition of the different ethnic groups. And now that we're mixing in, and now that we have so many Portuguese mixed with different ethnicities, the Portuguese community needs to rethink all these prejudices and all these generalities.
Well, I think to your point is when they immigrated here, there was a line drawn in the sand, and it was os Americanos on this side and everybody else over here. And they saw that if you aligned yourself with the people over here, that their lives were much more difficult, and the Americans had it good. So to assimilate, they assimilated with the Americans, and that means absorbing their culture. And if the Americans, who you saw as the American dream, as the goal that you aspire to, if they're telling you or showing you, or through through the systematic racism, through a lot of different systems that we have in this country, if you're seeing that to be that is bad, you're going to shy away from that, absorb the customs, and start to point the finger the other way and be like, I don't want to be like that.
Or even with the ignorance part is taking that and going, well, even though I may feel differently, I'm not going to defend that. I think a lot of times,
yeah, absolutely.
I think because it's fear of, I don't want to be rejected because I'm okay with that person being Michigan or black or whatever. And I think that's where we need to start having the conversations. And yes, festas, we socialize. I know for us, we tell everybody, we don't care what your religion is. You don't have to be Catholic. Come to the festa, because it's about feeding the people, right? That's how we present our festa. But a lot of times you wonder, are people, and I saw that Mr. Costa had put, are we alienating non-people? Well, I know for us, we do our best in promoting and saying anyone is welcome to come. Does that mean that people feel comfortable coming? I don't know. Because I'm Portuguese and I'm on the inside. And so that's the hard part of knowing that. But I think a lot of times we're afraid to have that conversation because we don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear that we are racist or that tone is not okay. And so for me, I think it is having those conversations. And I've all my employees, my staff, I have a staff of 7, and we're all mixed. There's Hispanics, there's white, there's Portuguese, and African American, and so you sit there and you go, okay, it was a conversation. Nickelodeon had a commercial that had they were 8 minutes of silence, and it was like deep breathing and stuff like that. And so we talked about it, and I said, I had a staff member that found it difficult because now you're presenting that to my child. And I told her, I said, I get it, but are you actually having a conversation with your child about what's happening out in the community? Why there are these protests? What is happening? Because a lot of times it'll be, well, that has nothing to do with us because we're white, our skin tone is white, it's not our issue. But ultimately it is. Those are human beings that need to have support. And whether me being quiet and sitting here doesn't help them, again, there's times where am I saying the right thing? Because I don't want to be stupid. I don't want to be rejected, but I want to support what the needs are for anyone in my community. And so I think that's the hard part of how do you overcome that? Because you don't want to be rejected personally, but you want to support what's happening in the individuals.
We're Americans, and those are Americans protesting. We should empathize with our Americans. It should be that simple.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Any comments, any additions on that? I thought you were going to say
I
something.
think it's just being able to confront it and talk about it. I mean, that's the biggest thing. And I think, in the Portuguese community, we tend to be just kind of culturally, we're more of like go with the flow type. And so it's hard to have these conversations. And even things as simple as, when somebody says a racist joke and, calling them out on it, like, that's not funny. And because, if you just laugh along, or if you don't laugh and you just stay quiet, then people think it's okay, that's, it's not a big deal to make those kind of jokes or those kind of statements. Whereas if you say something, maybe, just bringing that awareness that, you might think that's funny, but I don't think it's funny. And that might be enough just to get them to like kind of take a step back and be like, okay, maybe, think about what they're saying a little bit more. But when we don't say anything at all, then people assume that we agree with them.
Yep.
And so, by the way, those of you who are following, if you'd like to pose a question, please do so. Direct question to any of one of the panelists, or a question to all of us. We have about 30 minutes or so left, and so we like to take questions from those who are participating as well. I'd like to move a little bit. I'm not going to be the opinionated. It's very hard to be a moderator and not be an opinionated moderator, because I have an opinion for everything in the world.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you.
I could never be a moderator because I have an opinion about everything.
Well, me too. I just wanted to add to what Telmo and a couple of you also have said about the relationship with Portugal, with the Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa, because I think that's a very important point. I think as a colonial power, we haven't got over that yet. And it seems like we in Portugal, and we in the communities as well, because need to have a very long conversation, Portugal as a country, with its diaspora, as Anselmo mentioned, about the role of colonialism in our history, and how it didn't end, obviously, as we all know, with Brazil in the 1800s. It continued until 1974, basically until 1975. And so the relationship, as you know very well, I know you know, and Telmo, and I think all of you as well, and those who are participating, the relationship between Portugal and its colonies in Africa is still a complicated relationship, because there's a lot of issues that have been kind of swept under the table, and they haven't been talked about in Portugal. Okay, and until that happens, it's sort of the same thing that I believe that we have in the United States. Some of the racist issues, some of the systemic racism that we have is because of these issues that we don't talk about, and Black Lives Matter is bringing it to the forefront, some of it, but just that alone, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about. So how do each and every one of you feel about the Black Lives Matter movement? And I ask that question because it has a lot of controversy in the Portuguese-American community. You go on social media and you see people who profess to be, whether it be liberal or conservative, it doesn't make any difference there. Well, it does, but but even you see it on both sides of the fence, that the all lives matter, which we all know why that came about. But people into long conversations about the all lives matter or the blue lives matter or whatever, all the other things that are put forth in order to be combative to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'd like to have your take on it, because it is an important movement that is going on in the United States. It's our country, it's where we live. The Black Lives Matter movement is not a movement, as I heard today on NPR, the very boring station, but that gives you some good context. That it's creating some roots, and it's going to have and it's having some meaningful conversations along with the protests. There are some meaningful conversations, such as this one, for example, I think, for the Portuguese-American community. So what are your feelings on the Black Lives Matter movement and how it's seen from your perspective in the Portuguese-American community?
So for me, I don't get into that realm with social media and all of that crap, because holy moly.
Yeah.
So let me just say this. I believe that all lives matter, but I think Black lives matter right now, if that makes sense. Does that, where every single life matters. But at this moment in our time, we need to be focusing on the rights of individuals that are being taken away, or being adjusted based off of stereotypes, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's, being Hispanic, DACA, immigrants. So for me, I believe everybody matters, but at this time, our community and our world needs to be focusing on the rights of individuals that are being taken away.
I have taken a step away from the stereotypical Portuguese of not getting involved. My current profile picture on Facebook is Black Lives Matter. So I've gone that realm. I changed ideologies in the 2000s to now. I'm not the same man today that I was back then. Some people say you start out liberal and become more conservative. I flip-flopped. So I went the other way, basically. And when I went to school in Sac State and worked at Apple, I got to meet new people that were outside of my bubble. And when it came to hearing their stories and hearing what they went through, and taking a new angle on my podcast, where with the first episode of the season 2, I have my Black friends give their personal stories of when they faced racism. It was everything from being called the N-word by a random van that drives up, to a friend of mine who had a gun pulled on him by a police officer, and all he was doing was sitting in his car. And hearing those stories, having them tell it to me, it's hard to not empathize with them. And I wanted to take the approach of, Black Lives Matter. There are issues that range all the way back to the Civil War that we haven't resolved. Many think the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, Civil War is over, that's it. It didn't end like that. I mean, within 11 years after the end of the Civil War, Union troops left the South, and the South went back to segregation and Jim Crow laws and Confederate statues. That's when it happened. And no one paid attention to it. Just let it be. So all that is leading up to now. No matter how much noise has been made, quiet protests, kneeling, wearing T-shirts, and still getting critiqued for protesting quietly like that, it's not surprising that we've hit the point that we're at right now, and people on the other side will bring up, well, Martin Luther King said no rioting. Well, Martin Luther King also said that while he despised rioting, he despised the circumstances that made people feel the only choice they had was to riot. So Martin Luther King felt it was wrong for him to, despise riots, but not despise the situations that create riots. People forget that part. They just go with the dream in 63 and forget what he said in 68.
Well, they also casually leave out that he was assassinated for the changes he was bringing about.
Exactly. He wasn't loved during his time. He was hated by half the country. And it's now we're at a forefront where now it's in your face every day. You need to be a part of it. And it's, as I've said on Facebook, I've proudly stated, I support the Black Lives Matter movement. Michael Che's stand-up was hilarious when he said, it's not Black lives are better, Black lives are greater, just matters. That's all.
And that's the thing, to not give a community, people that have been so taken advantage of in this country, to not let them have this moment to step back and acknowledge that, yes, your lives matter, is mm-hmm. Like Rosemary said, yes, all lives matter. But here's how I've told people this. If you broke your hand and you went to the doctor and you said, my hand's broken, we should fix it. And he said, well, we should look at all your bones.
Yeah, check everything.
You would say, yeah, but the hand is what's broken, so let's fix that first, if that makes sense. So we're not saying that all your bones don't matter. You need every single one of them, but there's one that's broken that needs immediate attention. So let's address that one before we spend time going over the rest of the body. And that's where we're at.
Yep. Black
people were brought here, but people say, oh, go back to Africa. They didn't come here. They didn't buy a ticket. They didn't get on a ship
exactly.
and ate in the dining room of the ship. They were brought here against their will, in chains. They were beaten. They were sold like animals. Then they were liberated, but then the 13th Amendment made it so they were still enslaved through institutionalized incarceration, okay, and the laws that allowed for that to happen, at one point they were allowed to vote, but then they were told you're worth 60% of a human being. That's what you're worth. Then, not too long ago, we're talking about when when my grandparents immigrated here, there were still places that were segregated. There were still places where people couldn't go to the same schools. Now we come a little bit further along, and these things keep happening over and over. And with all the progress that we've made, it's still happening. Black people are still being killed at a higher rate by the police in this country. They're being profiled by the authorities. They are, even in things like food security, which people don't understand about, and I've had a chance to learn about lately. Black communities and have a tremendous handicap when it comes to having access to nutrition, to medicine, to education. There's still people don't understand those things because they're not in the community. They're not looking at it. They go, oh, it's fine. Or they see athletes making a lot of money. They go, oh, they have the same chances. Mm-hmm. I recently did some work for as a chef for a high profile athlete, a Black American. And he drives a nice car. He got pulled over. The first question he was asked was if it was a rental. Mm-hmm. He moved into his new house. He immediately got questioned whether he lived there. So does this money buy him the privilege of people not treating him as a suspect? No. And this is why people are fed up with it. And this is why people are saying Black Lives Matter, and we need to address this now. Now, to say all lives matter is to basically take away from that messaging. It is basically to say, actually, they don't, because that's what you're saying. Because in the moment we understand we need to address this. So until Black Lives Matter in this country, not all lives matter, if that makes sense.
And we forget also the impact that the movie Birth of a Nation had in this country in 1921, which Woodrow Wilson showed at the White House. And HBO's Watchmen, which came out last year, featured a historical moment, the Tulsa race riots, that many people didn't know about until a comic book TV show put it into their history and background. And that was just a few months ago.
Well, but that's just one example. Black Wall Street, for example.
Yeah.
The whole Central Park in New York used to be a Black community that they found a place where they created community, and white people decided they didn't like it, so they tore it down to make a park. Yep. Manhattan Beach in LA was settled as a Black community, and once again, people decided they weren't comfortable with it. So it's just example after example, and now whether we're lucky or unlucky because of technology, we are seeing firsthand what is happening. We have the opportunity to see it with our own eyes, because in cases like Emmett Till, it was just one white lady accusing some kid of doing something. He had no trial. He just got, I mean, if you know the story, how terrible it is. But now you actually have the technology to look at it and go, whoa, this is happening, and this is happening in a certain way. So how can we address this? And I think we need to, as human beings, white, Portuguese, whatever, it doesn't matter. As a human being, I think you need to look at it. And if you can't empathize with what's going on and the suffering that this community has dealt with, and a community that yeah, they're angry at times, but they're not filled with hate. I've gotten an opportunity to work through COVID-19 with the San Francisco African American Faith-Based Coalition to provide meals to people in need during this time, and people are angry and upset and they want change, but they're not filled with hate. They just want to be part of the dream. They want to be included. They don't want to be left out. They want to be treated the same. They don't want to be treated better. They want to be on equal footing. And if somebody can't find it in their heart to say, you as a human being deserve to be on the same playing field and the same rules of the game as me, then I think that's a fundamental problem, a moral problem that no church, no mass, no amount of times of reading the Bible is going to fix. Because if you're a religious person, you would subscribe to the theory that God created man in his image. So how all of a sudden then, but the black man is different? No, it's all of man. So if all of man is created in his image, why wouldn't everybody be equal? It's because of fear. It's because people are scared that they're going to get the upper hand because they've seen what the white America has done to natives, black people, and so white America is so scared to become the minority because they think everybody else will do the same onto them.
And we're almost out of time. This is
sorry.
No, that's okay.
You wanted me on,
and we do. This could have been a 3-hour conversation, but I do want us to. I want to hear if anyone else would like to add to what Telmo just said in that perspective, of the Black Lives Matter movement. Mary, how do you feel about that? And because for many reasons, obviously.
Well, I mean, on a personal level, my husband's an immigrant from Jamaica, so he has a very different perspective because he grew up in Jamaica. He's only been here going on 10 years, but so he has a little bit different perspective, not having the trauma that the African Americans went through. I mean, they have their own. I mean, he came from slaves as well, but he grew up in a community where he was the majority, and so. Sometimes I have to kind of point things out to him. Like when I was single, I would sometimes pay my tags. They come in the mail. I'd stick them in my glove box and I'd drive for 6 months on expired tags. Now that we trade cars back and forth all the time, as soon as those tags come, we're putting them on there. I don't want no excuse for him to get pulled over because you just don't know in today's climate what that could result in. And my husband's very mild mannered, but you just don't know, just everything that we see and hear and news stories. So those are just kind of things that, if you're not living it or don't have a loved person that in your family that you are always kind of like more vigilant about, like wanting to make sure that you're protecting them. Those are things that people don't even think about because I didn't think about them before, I got married and now I want to make sure that, we make sure our taillights are never out. We make sure that, things like that, no American should have to like be worried about those kind of things. It's like a minor thing. You get pulled over, it's a fix-it ticket, but it's different for the Black community in America. Working in education, another thing that we talk a lot about is the school to prison pipeline and how, African-American students get, suspended and expelled at much higher rates than other students. There's so much research that's been done and experiments that were done where teachers were given 2 cume folders of the same exact student, just the names were different. One student had a white sounding name, one student was a African American sounding name, but the violations in their file were exactly the same. And teacher after teacher said that the student who had the African American name should have a harsher punishment. So there's just so much that, from an education perspective, because that's where I'm working now, and then from a mental health perspective, because I do the mental health and education piece. One thing that my program focuses a lot on is in trauma-informed practices in schools, and we do a lot of training for school staff on trauma. And a lot of times people think of child abuse, of course, as trauma, and witnessing a violent episode or national crises and things like that, but people don't often do not consider generational trauma or historical trauma as something that kids carry on with them. And then compiled with experiencing racism in our society, that just makes it even harder. And a lot of our students of color really carry a lot of trauma with them, which a lot of times people are not sensitive to. And so that's something that is very close to my heart because of what I do and also with my own kids. Even though my kids, luckily we have not experienced that yet, but they're still very young and they tend to not experience that until they're a little bit older. So it's something that we did have these conversations, and people need to just be a little bit more open-minded. And until we bring it to the forefront, people are not going to be able to think about things outside of the box. So I think Black Lives Matters is bringing up these really important conversations, and hopefully will make people a little bit more aware of that not everybody experiences life in America the same way.
With our boys, my wife is half Portuguese, so our boys are primarily Portuguese, but we try to open them up to everything as they're young. Their ages 6 and 4, so they love superheroes like Daddy does. So it's showing them not only Iron Man but also Black Panther. It's showing them Peter Parker Spider-Man and Miles Morales Spider-Man, and it's at this young age where color isn't mattering to them. They just see heroes that they love of different looks and different styles and cultures. So.
Yes,
hopefully
mine are 5 and 7, so similar age. But, yeah.
There is one thing that I wanted to share. There's a movie that, you know, with everything going on, my oldest daughter, she's 17, and she was like, "Mom, I need you to watch this movie because it is so imperative to what is happening today." And it's called The Hate You Give. I don't know if you've ever watched it.
Heard of it.
But it is, it definitely gives the perspective of young teenage lives today and what they're dealing with. So Mary, when you were talking about the car, you know, not having the taillights out or any of those things, it's those specific scenarios, as well as the barriers with education, the barriers with careers. And where kids are having to turn to drug dealing because they're not given the same opportunities. And so I encourage people that are watching to watch that movie with an open mind. It's called The Hate You Give. Very eye-opening, you know, and I think you can understand where I'm coming from. I do support all nationalities, but it just tore me apart because I thought we need to be doing more as a society, as a community, and come together to support the African American community.
Those wondering, The Hate You Give is on Hulu, Amazon Prime, and HBO. So if you have any of those, you can watch it there.
And I think we're coming up on the end. I have only about actually 4.5 minutes, and so
so
I'd
fast.
I'd like to thank all of you. There's a lot of things that we could continue this conversation. Maybe we will, but in about a few seconds each, we talked about empathy. We talked about, of course, involvement. We talked about, you know, being part of the conversation. But is there one or two action items that any of you would like to share that you think it might be important for organizations such as the California Portuguese-American Coalition and other organizations that are in the Portuguese-American community that, you know, go, I mean, there's a lot of organizations are involved in, of course, is what they do. They do a festa or they do, you know, a soccer club or whatever. But there are some social organizations and cultural organizations, the Luso-American Education Foundation, the California Portuguese-American Coalitions, and others. So what do you like to suggest in like about 30 seconds each, if that's possible, one or two action items that might be helpful that we take upon ourselves to kind of promote within the Portuguese-American community to continue this dialogue and to move forward in the community to the 21st century that will be different as we didn't touch upon it with all the detail that we wanted to about the intergenerational or the difference between the generations. But unfortunately, not all young people think the way those of you do. Okay, there's a lot of people, especially in the valley where I'm from, that young people that are very, very, very think totally different than all of you do, and we're hoping to have some of those on. You know, for this conversation as well, because we want to hear from everybody. How do you feel, or what are one or two action items? I'm kind of mumbling, so I can give you some time to think of one or two action items that you think might be important for us to do as we move forward. Anybody like to take that one on, or just one action item?
I think just visibility within the Portuguese community of some of people that there's Black Portuguese people even, but if people of the diaspora, including telling that story. And I know it's troubled, and I know there's a lot of deep-rooted issues there, but until you start doing something about it, you can't make a change. Educate yourselves, read on the Black American experience, and just educate yourselves. Just try to put yourself in someone else's shoes.
Yes.
I think it's having open and honest conversations such as this. and including, so not that I'm nominating myself, I'm not volunteering, Diniz, but having those conversations with those that have a different opinion, and really getting to the root, because yes, we all feel the same way, and so we're all standing on our soapbox together, and so I think that the next step is having conversations with people that maybe don't feel the same way, and honest, frank conversation, and say, well, do you understand where I'm coming from? And I know I saw on Facebook someone had posted something about, political, when you're with your family, we don't talk about politics, we agree to disagree, we're just not going to go there. I am 100% in that situation a lot. And so I think it's, if we can have a frank and sincere conversation that's respectful, I think that is how we approach this, and really discussing with those that have different points of views to see how we can move forward.
Diniz, you've been kind of doing it on Facebook too, where you're sharing quotes from books lately from Kindle. I say pushing books from authors that maybe Portuguese community isn't aware of. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, James Baldwin books, Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, putting those books out there so at least there's the resources that people can get to.
Luis?
Well, our community is not really very given to exchanging ideas. We don't have too many venues where we discuss things. Radio could be one venue. We have to realize that we have to start separating the old immigrant community from the young kids already with different ideas and different ways of looking at things. So are we trying to exchange ideas with all levels of the community, or we try to use more modern techniques like social media, etc.? So we need to discuss that to see where we're going to go from here. Because in the traditional Portuguese community, I think the only place where I've seen any exchange of ideas, rarely, but yes, is in the radio and in the churches. That would be a possibility, but I'm not so sure if that's if that's a topic that's under consideration.
That would be interesting.
Interesting is a good word.
Well, thank you all so much. And Mary had to leave, but thank you all so much. Thanks to Mary, thanks to Anthony, Telmo, Louise, Rosemary. Thanks to all of you who participated. We will have this archived at the PBBI Fresno State YouTube channel. We will also have this, of course, as part of our, it'll be transcribed, and it will be part of the Portuguese oral history that we're collecting, because this is who we are. And so we need to have these stories archived and transcribed for future generations. That's one of our things that hasn't, it's kind of in the realm of this as well, is, for example, we have very little in history of even our Portuguese presence here in California. And so that will be archived there as well. And of course, we'll have this featured on Facebook and all the other social media. We'll have another one of these in about a month. We'll send we'll get the information about the panelists. So thanks to this outstanding panel. Indeed, this could have gone on for another hour and a half. And thank you, because these are courageous statements that all of you made. And I believe that hopefully they will have an impact on everybody. And we need to continue to have these conversations in the Portuguese-American community. So many thanks to all of you, and we'll take care. Stay safe, stay healthy.
And thank you, Diniz, for putting this together and for moderating and to giving a voice to a topic that is needs to be amplified in our community. And change isn't easy, but you have to tackle the difficult issues to try to create change. So thank you, and I appreciate you inviting me to be on.
Oh, my pleasure to inviting all of you. Thank you also very much.
And if you're in San Francisco, go eat at Telmo's restaurant.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. After all these panels and after we're back to normality, we're going to get all these panelists.
Only to go right now.
We'll have to get all these panelists together and go to San Francisco after this whole ordeal.
Make some tashkas maybe outside? Tashkas, no?
No, people don't follow the rules. Until people start following the rules.
Of course.
Well, we're not going to endanger anybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you,
Be
Diniz.
safe. Be healthy.
you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you.